Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you for coming to this talk. I was asked to speak on Birthplace of Monotheism. I have elected to somewhat modify the content. Because I thought it would not be so interesting to speak about the tenets of Islam and to speak about the belief system. I would rather speak about Islam as a living culture and civilization. But I also want to bring in an interreligious dimension. I wanted to speak about the interaction between Islam and other civilizations. And let me begin with this topic, the so-called Constitution of Medina. It's not a good translation. Sometimes it's been translated, I think, more accurately as the Charter of Medina. This was a document which records a series of agreements made by Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, with the non-Muslims of Medina, primarily with the Jews of Medina, because when the Prophet was in Medina and when the Muslim community began to emerge in Medina, there was already a prominent Jewish community. And I think it's very important for us to take note of that, because if you look at relations between Jews and Muslims today, you find that on the Muslim side there is a significant degree of Judeophobia, right? And of course that has in a large part to do with the creation of Israel, the disenfranchisement of Palestinians, the loss of their land, and so on. But it has nonetheless created this caustic relations between Jews and Muslims, and it has colored the way Muslims look at Judaism. And that often takes, it often results in people not realizing that Muslims and Jews actually had rather good relations for centuries, and much better than relations between European Christians and Jews, actually. And these relations go back to the time of the Prophet. Now, in the Sahifa, the Arabic name for the so-called Constitution or Charter of Medina, the part of the agreement that the Prophet made with the Jews was that those Jews who did not convert to Islam would live as Jews by Jewish law, and that their rights as Jews would be protected by the Muslim community. In return, the Jews in Medina were not to fight against the Muslims or fight alongside the enemies of the Muslims in return for their being protected by the Muslim community and having the right to live as Jews and live according to Jewish law. And the Prophet referred to the Jews and the Muslims as being part of one ummah, one community, which is interesting because today the term ummah or community refers primarily to the Muslim community, not a multi-religious community. So this idea of monotheism, in other words, goes beyond its theological sense. It's extended to a more sociological and political sense, the idea of a real community, not just commonality in terms of beliefs, beliefs in one God, the common beliefs that Jews, Christians, and Muslims have, but it extends to being a sociological concept where we're speaking about an actual historical concrete community in which similarities are recognized and the rights of each other are mutually recognized. But I think for me, what is important to stress is not simply the similarities that are recognized between Muslims and Jews and Christians, but also not simply to recognize the similarities as an ideal to aspire towards, but to go beyond that, to see to what extent communities in the past, in history, actually realize those ideals. Do you understand what I mean? When I talk about realizing ideals, for example, if we say that Islam is a religion of peace, Islam means that, right? It's derived from the word salam, which means peace. It's all very well to make that claim that Islam is about peace. But when you look at the Muslim world today, it's hardly a peaceful region. It's not a peaceful region for many reasons. Part of the reason has to do with imperialism. Part of the reason has to do with the colonial past. When I say imperialism, I'm talking about primarily American imperialism in the Middle East. That's part of the reason. But Muslim countries are also violent, have violent governments, dictators. Muslim theologians have, some of them have violent notions of Islamic law. So part of the reason for violence has to do with Islamic tradition itself. We can't blame everything on colonialism and imperialism. So when we talk about peace as an ideal, we also need to inquire as to whether that ideal was aspired towards and put into practice in the history of Muslim societies or the history of Islamic civilization. So, for example, when we say that the Prophet Muhammad had made a series of agreements in which Jews were to live peacefully side by side Muslims, we want to know whether that was merely an ideal that was expressed by the Prophet, or whether it was something that was put into practice by Muslims throughout history. And that is what I would, like to refer to. This is one point. The second point I'd like to make is that to the extent, and this comes from the first point, to the extent that today Europe, or the West in general, to the extent that the West wants to have peace with the Muslim world and wants to have peace with Muslims, they need to see the Muslim world, they need to see the religion of Islam as part of their own heritage. It is necessary that the West looks at Islam as part of its own civilization, and I'll elaborate on that. Now, first, so let me go to the first point. You have the Constitution of Medina. You have a particular attitude towards Jews, and this attitude towards Jews, that they are to live side by side Muslims and their rights as Jews were to be protected, was also extended from the very early days of Islam excuse me, to the Christian community as well. The Prophet had made a series of agreements or covenants with various Christian communities. One of the most famous was the covenant concerning I think it was called St. Catherine's Monastery in Egypt, in the Sinai, I think, if not mistaken, in which the Prophet told the Muslims that the monastery was to be protected, that passage to and fro was to be guarded, and that the property in and around the monastery and the people going to and fro were to be protected. And this was one among many other agreements or covenants that the Prophet made. So there was a very strong message given by the Prophet and by the early Muslim rulers regarding the protection of Christians and Jews and their places of worship. Now, we can find throughout Islamic history examples of how this attitude was put into practice. I think it's well known what is well known is the position of Jews and Christians in Andalusia, in Spain, right? To the extent that Spain under Muslim rule has been regarded by the Jews themselves as the height of Jewish civilization, the flourishing of Jewish philosophy and culture, theology, and so on. And it's also interesting to note that with the Reconquista of Spain, during which time there was Spanish Muslims and Jews experienced Inquisition and persecution, many Jews from Spain fled to Morocco and to Turkey, to Ottoman Turkey. And for that reason, you have you had up until the early part of the 20th century, you had a large Jewish population in Turkey. What is lesser known is a series of events that happened during the period of World War II, during the Nazi occupation of parts of Europe. Turkish consulates in parts of Europe issued fake. Well, I suppose they're not fake because they were issued by the Turkish government, but they issued passports to Jews, which enabled these Jews, European Jews, to escape Nazi-occupied areas and go to Turkey. And you find the descendants of these Jews in Turkey today. Of course, they have become, Turks. So those Turkish Jews are to be distinguished from the descendants of Jews who fled Andalusia in the 15th century and moved to Turkey. And we can provide many other examples of how of relations between Jews and Muslims under Islamic rule. This was the case not only in Ottoman Turkey, but also in Morocco, in Iran. Of course, I mentioned Andalusia, Muslim Spain. In fact, throughout the Muslim world, this was the case. In fact, the Jewish community in Singapore, there is a small Jewish community in Singapore. They are actually Arab Jews. They originate from Baghdad. They are called Baghdadi Jews. And they came to Singapore around the same time that the Arabs came to Singapore in the 19th century. And the Arab Jews and the Arab Muslims in Singapore have had a close, strong relationship. Sometimes when there were legal problems among or within an Arab family, the lawyer was a Jew. If you ask some of the old Arab families in Singapore, the Al-Sagafs and the Bin Talibs, they will tell you about their relationship with their Jewish lawyers. So now, given that there is this relationship, you have the possibilities of a trans-religious civilization, what I mean by trans-religious civilization, a civilization, an interreligious civilization. And then, obviously, there is an Islamic civilization, there is a Jewish, and there's a Christian civilization. But is there the possibility of a civilization that cuts across the religious divide? Now, of course, there is the possibility, because there is such a thing. For example, there is such a thing as Judeo-Christian civilization. There's a notion of Judeo-Christian civilization. Now, Judeo-Christian is a term that emerged in the late 18th century or early 19th century. In those days, when it first emerged, it referred more to the integration of Jewish and Christian beliefs. It also referred to the Jewish converts to Christianity in those early days, but primarily it referred to the integration of Jewish and Christian beliefs. As time went by, I think certainly by the late 19th century, the early 20th century, Judeo-Christian meant or referred to a more inclusive conception of American culture that recognized, which is primarily Christian, but recognized its roots in Judaism. And it was used in both an inclusive as well as an exclusive way. Inclusive in the sense that it recognized the roots of American culture in Jewish culture, but exclusive in the sense that it meant to separate, to distinguish what was good about American culture from what was considered to be bad, such as socialism, communism, and so on. So it has been used in an inclusive as well as an exclusive manner. Now, my point is that if the West is to be serious about establishing close ties with the Muslim world, they have to see themselves as more than just Judeo-Christian. And I would like to suggest that, and I accept that the West is not only Christian, it is also Judeo-Christian, but I would also like to suggest that the West is as Islamic as it is Jewish. That the Islamic influence on the West is as important as the Jewish influence on the West. That the West has to see not only Judaism but also Islam as part of its heritage. And I'd like to give a few examples of that. Does this work? Oh, I should point there. Okay, I'm pointing there. That's really ridiculous, right? It's silly to point to point this at a piece of material. All right. So I was saying that the West has to see itself as not only Judeo-Christian, but Judeo-Christo-Islamic. All right? And how can we make that argument? We make that argument based on the idea that many significant aspects of Western civilization are influenced by Islam. Many significant aspects of Western civilization come from Islam. Now, if we were to we can find so many examples of this. Now, some of the commonplace examples, people will often cite, the fact that you find Arabic words in the English language, which are testimony to the influence of certain aspects of Islamic civilization. For example, algebra. Algebra comes from al-Jabr, from the field or the branch of mathematics that we call algebra was developed by the Muslims. by Arabic-speaking Muslims. They were not Arabs necessarily. Many of them were actually Persian origin. But the lingua franca was Arabic. It wasn't any Frankish language. Of course, we're using a Eurocentric term, lingua franca, and maybe it's more accurate to say lingua arabica. It was Arabic. And we find that many philosophical and theological doctrines developed by scholars like Ibn Rushd, by Ibn Sina, known as Averroes or Avicenna, respectively, had great influence on the medieval Christian world, on medieval Christian philosophy and theology. In fact, for example, Ibn Rushd or Averroes, as he was known as in Latin, Averroes was so influential that there was a school of Christian theology in Europe known as Latin Averroism in medieval times. So one could go so far as to say that medieval Christian theology and even early developments in philosophy, in epistemology, in the scientific method, and of course, the Enlightenment itself, would not have taken place the way they did had it not been for the influence of Muslim philosophy and theology. Not to mention the influence of Muslim science and Muslim learning on the Europeans. And this is not to say that there were not the influences of other civilizations, such as the Indians and the Chinese on Europe. But very often, the Chinese and Indian influences came via the Muslim world, because the Chinese and the Indians did not have direct contact with the Muslim world, with Europe. Europe shared a common border with the Muslim world and had direct contact, right? Now, there are other examples of influences that are not so well known, influences of the Muslim world on Europe. There are other examples that are not so well known. And here I put up a couple of slides on the early universities in the Muslim world. You have here Al-Azhar University, which is well known, but you also have other examples. The Qayrawiyyin University in Fez, which was founded in the 9th century. Al-Azhar was also founded, well, actually, people say Al-Azhar was the oldest university, but it wasn't. It was founded in 1859, which is the oldest university. And you also have the, this is actually older. Yeah. The Zaytuna. Zaytuna was where Ibn Khaldun, centuries later, was to teach. Now, why do I mention these universities? Because these universities actually provided the model for the modern university that we have today. They provided the model in the sense, not only in terms of the content of education, but also in the structure of education. For example, the idea of the degree, right? In European universities, does anybody know what the degree is called in Europe? I'm talking about in languages other than English. In English, it's called the degree. But what about other languages? Diplôme, okay, but license? In French, licence? In Italy, what do they call in Italy? Any Italian here? Baccalaureate, yes. Okay, I'm coming to that term, actually, baccalaureate. But license, right? Or licencia. In Latin or in Spanish or in Italian. Now, this idea of licence or license is a direct translation of the Arabic word ijaza, right? Ijaza has been used from the very beginning in these institutions, long centuries before the emergence of the European university, of the European medieval university. Now, the means of granting the ijaza or the licence, the means of granting it was symbolized by the teacher, the sheikh, placing his cap on the head of the student. And also, at the same time, or sometimes both his cap and his robe. He placed his robe on the back on the shoulders of the student. So this is possibly the origin of your cap and gown ceremony, right? Now it's also interesting that in the medieval European universities, which the University of Paris, University of Bologna, that emerged a good 2 or 3 centuries after the Islamic counterparts, that those universities, the structure of those universities, were also probably influenced by the Muslim structure. Those universities the medieval European universities, were based on charitable endowments, which had a similar form of establishment and governance as the Muslim institution of the endowment, the religious endowment, or the waqaf, right? So a plot of land would be provided by a donor, and it would be as an endowment, meaning that the donor would specify that this land is meant for the construction of an institution of learning. And that institution of learning and the land for that, by law, because it is endowed as such, would be required to function in that manner, and it would be protected by Islamic law, right? So the early European universities were established on that basis as well, and they were called charitable endowments in English. I'm not sure what the terms were in other languages, but in English they were referred to as charitable endowments. So you find that not only the content of some fields in science and technology, philosophy and theology were influenced by the Muslims, but also the very structure of education. Now, it's interesting that one of the Orientalists, Alfred Guillaume, he speculated that the term baccalaureate itself is a corruption of an Arabic term. In the Muslim institutions, when the sheikh when the sheikh gave his ijaza or license or permission to his student to carry on his teachings, and he symbolized that by putting his cap or his gown on the student, he uttered the words, and sometimes it was also written down, ijaza, licence, bihaqqa riwaya, permission to transmit, basically it means. So Alfred Guillaume said that baccalaureate is a corruption of bihaqqa riwaya. And that idea is, now people think that baccalaureate is a Latin word, but Guillaume was suggesting that it wasn't originally a Latin word because there's no root word for baccalaureate. There isn't apparently a root word, for it's not originally a Latin word, rather it's a word that it came into Latin as a corruption of Arabic. And there are many examples of European words, including English words, that are corruptions from Arabic. For example, the Rock of Gibraltar, that's a corruption of Arabic. What is it a corruption of? Rock of Gibraltar. Jabal al-Tariq. Admiral is supposed to be a corruption of Amir al-Bahar, the ruler or the prince of the seas, right? Many examples of Arabic words that have come into English or European languages in a corrupted form, as happens in when words get transferred from one language to another. So the modern Western university, the modern university today, is a product of at least 3 civilizations. Obviously, the European civilization, also the Muslim civilization. And one more, can you think of that? What is that third civilization? No. Well, I put that under the European category. The third civilization is the Chinese civilization. One of the things that the Chinese contributed was the mass examination system. That system did not exist in the medieval European or in the early Islamic universities. It is something that the Europeans took from the Chinese. So we have, at least 3 civilizational origins of the modern university, right? These 3 civilizations are the heritage of the modern university. So this is an example that I wanted to give of the Islamic dimension of modern Western civilization. This is another picture of Zaytuna University. Now I put this here. This is the Hagia Sophia in Istanbul, which is a 5th century Byzantine church. Has anyone been there? Some of you have been there. Now, there is also this is the interior of the Hagia Sophia. And this is the Sultan Ahmed, or the famous Blue Mosque, which was built opposite the Hagia Sophia. Now, there are many similarities. In fact, the Turkish, the Ottoman, there are layers of different civilizations in Turkey. You have the Ottoman period, but you also have the pre-Ottoman period in which the architecture is different. Now, Ottoman era mosques, those constructed after the conquest of Istanbul, were very much influenced by the Hagia Sophia, the architecture of the Hagia Sophia. You look at the dome, right? You see the similarities between the church dome, the Hagia Sophia dome, and the Blue Mosque. And you look at any of the post-Istanbul conquest mosques, you'll find that they have this structure. What this means is that and this I think speaks to the attitude that the Ottomans as Muslims had towards Christian civilization. They were obviously enamored, in awe of the architecture of the Hagia Sophia, so much so that they incorporated into the design of, in a very big way, in a very significant way, into the design of the mosque that they built. If you look at mosques constructed in Turkey in pre-Istanbul, before Istanbul was part of the Ottoman Empire, they're entirely different. The Seljuk period, for example, the mosques are entirely different in terms of their structures and colors and aesthetics. But what is interesting in terms of our theme, right, the Islamic heritage of European civilization, is what you find in medieval cathedrals and churches. What do you think is interesting about this? What has it got to do with Islam? What has this got to do with Islam? I'm not suggesting that just the design of the carpets, but I'm suggesting the carpets themselves. Because the Europeans were not making these carpets. These were Turkish or Persian carpets, right? And what is interesting is these are not just material or fabric that you step on, right? These carpets are designed by Muslims with Islamic motifs. Because Turkish and Persian and other carpets made in the Muslim world are based on designs that express an Islamic view of things, an Islamic worldview. For example, the floral or vegetal or geometric designs reflect the idea of the infinity of the universe, or the order of the universe. One of the features of, if you compare carpets made or woven by Muslims with carpets woven by Buddhists, Mongolians, Chinese. You find that in the Muslim carpets, there are very rarely will you find empty spaces. The carpets are busy with designs, whether they are geometric or floral or vegetal designs, because it reflects the attitude that there is no such thing as a void. Everything in the universe is a creation. There is no place where there is nothing. It's either God or what God created. It's called I think in aesthetic terms, in art, it's referred to as the horror of the void. You don't pretend that there is such a thing as a void. So this idea is expressed in the weaving of carpets, and an artifact like a carpet, which expresses an Islamic worldview, is found as central pieces in Christian art, in European Christian art, and of course in the cathedrals and churches themselves. In fact, if you go to some of the old cathedrals and churches in Europe today, you'll still find these carpets. And certainly if you go to Istanbul, some of the old churches date back to the 16th, 15th century, you will find these carpets. So here you find a very nice conversation between Islamic and Christian civilization, right? Ice cream, right? Ice cream, they say it came from the Arabs or from the Persians. Many of the words that we use are actually derived from Arabic. For example, sherbet. Sherbet, you know that kind of ice cream called sherbet? For us, it's a kind of ice cream, right? Sherbet. But sherbet apparently comes from the Arabic word. Here it says Persian. I guess it's used in Persian as well. Sharbat, which is not really ice cream. It's kind of snow ice flavored with syrup. Syrup itself is derived from Arabic, sharab, which refers to a thick concentration of sweet derived from a thick, fruity, and sweet concentration. Right? That's syrup. So apparently, according to, I don't know how reliable, because I have to admit, my daughter researched this for me. Okay. When the Arabs conquered Persia, they added milk and sugar to the sharbat, and that became ice cream. Right? And how did that go into Europe? During the conquest, when the Arabs went to Sicily, and I think also later on, some centuries later, during the Crusades. During the Crusades, Europeans took many things, including ice cream, perfume, maybe possibly pepper. Apparently pepper, in the English pepper comes from filfil, from Arabic filfil. Of course, the Muslims, the Arabs, the Persians, they themselves brought pepper from this part of the world, right? From the Far East. So, I think that's quite interesting, that it's not only philosophy, theology, the university, the idea of the university as a degree-granting institution, or the term baccalaureate and so on and so forth. It's not just those major dimensions of civilization that had influenced Europe, but it's also the simple things like ice cream and pepper. And what else? Nothing else. Okay. Let me give you another example, which you're all familiar with, but maybe you don't realize that this is part of Islamic heritage. You've heard of Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves? Everybody grows up with that. Every European kid, every Western American kid grows up with Ali Baba. Am I right? Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, and what else? Who often goes? Aladdin and the Magic Lamp, Sinbad the Sailor, right. And even in this part of the world, we grew up with that. Why? Because of colonialism. Because of colonialism. And I don't think any European kid or any European considers Aladdin as something foreign and something alien. It's part of their culture. It has become part of their culture, as well as many other things which can be traced back to Islamic civilization. So, therefore, what I'm saying is, if you look at the high civilization, philosophy, or high culture, the arts, literature, you will find some Islamic roots for Western civilization. If you look at everyday life, you look at ice cream, you look at pepper, you look at other things, you will find some roots of Western civilization in Islam. And to be sure, the Jewish roots are there as well. But the West has only recognized its Jewish roots and refers to itself as Judeo-Christian. But I would like to suggest that the West should also think of itself as Islamic, as Judeo-Christo-Islamic. Because the Islamic roots are as important as the Jewish roots. Not only in terms, and the reason for referring to Western civilization or modern civilization as Judeo-Christian Islamic is not simply to say that there are similarities. Obviously, there are similarities between the three religions. They are all monotheistic faiths. But beyond that, they've had interaction over the centuries which has affected each of them. And certainly, modern Western civilization is deeply affected not only by its Jewish roots, but also by its Islamic roots. So, if there is to be meaningful dialogue between the West and Islam, there should be a recognition in the West of its Islamic heritage. And of course, in the Muslim world, there also has to be a recognition of the impact of Western civilization on the Muslims. And I'm speaking, of course, a recognition of the positive impact of Western civilization on the Muslim world. There's also, obviously, the negative impact. I mean, colonialism is an example of a great negative impact. But one also has to recognize the positive impact and to realize that aspects of Western civilization have become part of Muslim civilization, just as aspects of Muslim civilization have become part over the centuries of Western civilization. So for dialogue to be meaningful, there has to be this recognition. And one place to start is for the West to consider itself as not just Judeo-Christian, but also Judeo-Christo-Islamic. So I'm happy to take any questions or get comments from you. Thank you.